Okay, I think we're all set to kick off the presentation. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're tuning in from. Welcome to the webinar, Modern Technology Strategies for Digital Experience Management with Catchpoint, Digital Enterprise Journal, and Datadog. My name is Peter Salidas. I'm a Senior Marketing Manager here at Catchpoint, and I'll be moderating the webinar. We'll get started in just a moment, but first, just a few housekeeping notes. All attendee lines are muted. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature in the GoToWebinar panel, and we will address submitted questions at the end of the presentation. Just a note, a recording of today's presentation will be sent out to all registrants and attendees over the next couple of days, along with additional resources around digital experience monitoring and tool integration. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Great. So first we have Boyan Simic. He is the founder of Digital Enterprise Journal, a media and research firm focused on digital transformation and the business value of technology deployments. Boyan has been an analyst and entrepreneur in the enterprise technology industry for more than 10 years. And as an industry analyst, Boyan has surveyed and interviewed tens of thousands of IT and business professionals from end user organizations and has published more than 100 research reports. Next, we have Zach Henderson. Zach is a performance engineer here at Catchpoint. Zach has given various presentations on customer experience and user experience monitoring on webinars and the conference circuit, and we're really glad to have him on the line here today. Last but certainly not least, we have Ilan Rabinovich, who is the Director of Technical Community and Evangelism at Datadog. Prior to joining Datadog, Ilan spent a number of years leading infrastructure and reliability engineering teams at organizations such as Uyala and Edmunds.com. In addition to his work at Datadog, he's active in the open source and DevOps communities, where he's a co-organizer of events such as Scale, Texas Linux Fest, DevOps Days LA, and DevOps Days Silicon Valley. Great, so we're going to kick off the presentation. I'm just going to give you a brief background of what the webinar content is. I'm going to pass you off to Boyan, who'll be your first speaker today. So Boyan is going to be going over an overview of the digital experience delivery today and what are today's technologies. He's going to share some recent research that his firm has found and why it matters to you. Then we're going to kick off, we're going to pass it off to Zach, who's going to explain how digital transformation has changed the way that we monitor end user experiences. And finally, Zach's going to pass off to Ilan, who's going to explain how containers and dynamic infrastructure are changing the way we monitor and measure. So I'm going to unmute you, Boyan, and give you keyboard and mouse control, and you should be able to take it away. Let me know if you can switch slides, Boyan.
Thanks, Peter. Looks like it's working. Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for taking the time today. So just a few quick notes before we get into research findings, as Peter mentioned, and give you some background information. So you will see a lot of data stats today, and you'll see some information about technology and general business trends that we are seeing in the industry. A lot of the data we'll be presenting today is collected either earlier this year or late in 2016, but being an analyst in this space for more than 10 years, we were also able to go back and do some trending analysis reaching back to 2008 and 2000, even some data points you will see from 2006. And one thing I think it's important to keep in mind, this is not necessarily a technology presentation. You will see different technology classes and how they come together. The approaches we took to actually analyzing and researching this matter is starting from the business problem, and then actually introducing different flavors of technologies that can address that problem. And also, as Peter mentioned, the whole notion of digital transformation, you will see some data there, and it's a kind of overarching theme that Digital Enterprise Journal covers. One of the areas that we are seeing from a business perspective and how the role of technology has been changing is that a lot of organizations that are doing well in digital transformation are using technology more as the core of their business strategy and then building business plan and go-to-market plan around it, as opposed to the traditional approach that many of you know has been around for many, many years, which is create a business plan and then ask technology folks to go and enable it. The whole notion around technology is a competitive advantage, as you will see later in the presentation. If you have a good strategy around it and you have it figured out, pays off. One good example is if you think about Netflix's blockbuster story, that was a business war, but it was not one based on prices, based on the quality of products. It was actually one based on technology, and we'll talk about that a lot today. So that is a good segue into the next slide. Data that you will see today comes from many different surveys. Obviously, we'll be talking about digital experience delivery today, and but there are also surveys that were done in 2016 around digital transformation, around IT monitoring. One of the key findings from digital transformation survey from late last year is obviously digital transformation means different things to different people, and it's a very hot topic in the market, but also at the same time it's really not well defined. But if you look at these numbers, number one and number two, 68% of organizations are saying that over the last 12 months they're experiencing high customer expectations around engagement and experience, and then just over 61% are saying that actually importance of technology or use of technology in gaining competitive advantage has increased. These are very hard numbers if you think about this actually happened over the course of 1 year. And that's going back to the previous slide where the whole concept of technology as competitive advantage is coming from. And later in the presentation, you will see how different flavors of digital experience delivery are tying to these top two goals. So as I mentioned, this research spans back to fall of last year, but some new data findings that we got earlier this year. That there was a study back in 2008 that I wrote that was called "Customers Have Won and Lost in 1 Second," and it was talking about the impact of 1 second delay in response times on business metrics such as conversions, page views, revenue loss, customer satisfaction, and in going back and looking in that time how that the whole chain of delivering applications to the end user looked. Technology landscape was really made out of, obviously, development side. A lot of vendors in that time that were on the load balancing or application delivery control side, CDNs, and the management portion of it was more focused on actual applications that are being used internally. Technologies such as application performance monitoring, network performance monitoring, infrastructure. What I thought was really interesting in the survey is if you look at this stat, that actually, on average, if you think about the whole delivery chain from the point where you have a concept around the application to the point where actually somebody interacts with the application in production, there are a lot of moving parts that constitute that delivery chain. What organizations are saying that on average, they are not seeing 43% of that delivery chain. And if you want to troubleshoot problems, if you want to prevent them before users are impacted, not having that type of visibility is a pretty serious issue. And the other number I thought was interesting is actually that if you look at the entire delivery chain, again from pre-production to the actual user experience, that there's a major disconnect between what is being built in pre-production and how is that going to impact the user experience. That organizations are using a lot of different management tools. You'll see that in a few minutes. But in many cases, these tools actually are not designed to talk to each other, or they don't have functionality that can tie these different areas of delivery chain from something that's being designed in development or DevOps stage to what business users are really experiencing. Third point I wanted to bring is and we'll talk about this a lot today, some new technologies that are entering the enterprise, some technologies that are not so new, but they're actually getting more traction, anywhere from cloud to different device types, to different application design types, or just rolling out new applications that organizations, from a management perspective, very often are not prepared to actually roll out new technologies, because in 64% of the cases that actually causes the decline in performance of either existing technologies or the new technologies that they just rolled out. And from a technology perspective, one area I wanted to bring up, and we'll talk about that today in more depth, is the whole notion around APIs and integration. That we did a study back in 2011, and we were asking about patterns in deploying APIs and patterns in managing APIs. And over the last 5.5, 6 years, we've seen 81% increase in number of organizations that are putting effort, not just monitoring performance of their website as a whole, but actually being able to understand how APIs are performing. And you will see how that plays into the whole transition from the quality of user experience to actually digital experience delivery that is the topic of our research today. So going back to that previous point, what is digital experience? If you look at number one and number two, availability and speed, you have a lot of KPIs around that, and I'm sure a lot of you obviously are aware of that. Page load times, waterfall metrics that have been around for a while, and those two are still very important. But how user experience actually transition to digital experience is actually introducing other areas that are very important to what you really get when you go to somebody's web property. Content is definitely one. And content, both content and integration actually tie back to APIs. And if you take Orbit, for example, that is a combination of APIs that go to different websites. Could be airlines, could be hotel chains. If the page is loading fine, website is available, none of us will actually notice that there is anything wrong with user experience because it's already there. But if the API is going to Marriott or API is going to American Airlines is not working, you will, from a content perspective and from a business perspective, you might not be able to see it, the best deals that you're looking for. And that for the web property itself and for a user actually has a major impact. And also a lot of functionalities that we've seen over the last couple of years that are becoming more and more important, some social media related, being able to actually personalize a user experience, not just from performance perspective, but actually being able to get what you really expect when you visit a certain website. And when I mentioned some of the things that we were doing on the research side from a technology perspective, so and this is a Techscape that we put together, researching a lot of these vendors and talking to them, talking to their customers, and there's 180 plus companies, unique companies that are here in 4 major areas and then 17 sub-markets within that. And it is important to look at this and think about that if you are looking to optimize digital experience, you're not looking to one solution or one class of technology. You're looking at the entire delivery chain that we talked about earlier. It starts from development. We talked about APIs already. Some of the infrastructure technology has been around for a while, but their features and functionalities changed, and especially in the areas of CDN and ADN. Cloud hosting and internet service providers playing a more important role in actually taking some of the management capabilities. And then even in the management space, you can see here 7 different sub-markets that they have their own dynamics and some major trends that we're seeing here. So picking a solution that can address the problem is not necessarily writing one RFP, is more taking a holistic approach, and that is a major goal that we took when we started conducting this research. So we talked about some of the numbers before from a technology and adoption perspective, and I want to look at some of the numbers from a business and end user perspective. We talked about that study from 2008 and impact of 1 second delay in response time. And you think that over the last 8+ years that people will actually figure that out. There's a lot of money to be lost. There should be some awareness around that. There should be some technology that can actually solve that. There should be some vendors that actually should put some innovation towards and be able to address that, and all of that happened. The problem with that was that the business issue became a moving target, that websites are not the same as they were in 2008. And going back to one of the previous slides, we were talking about 5 aspects of digital experience. As a result, over the last 8+ years, we've only seen on average 24% increase in response times. It's not because people didn't know how to address the problem from 2008. It's just the problem changed. that there were more technology and management aspects that they had to manage. The other area that I thought was really important is actually that over the last 12 months, 56% of organizations said that they're seeing their customers looking to engage with different channels, different devices, anywhere from mobile to different hardware devices, also to different channels in terms of if you think about social media channels versus traditional websites, and a lot of third-party services that come to play are also causing some of the management challenges that also brings us back to that 24% number and why it's not higher than it really is. And the other area why it's making this even more important, the whole notion around digital transformation, and what we talked about today earlier, is using technology as a source of competitive advantage. Depends on what industry vertical you're in. You can do that many different ways, but 48% of organizations are saying that actually they are using, they're looking to become a digital business and using digital technologies to create new revenue streams. It could be anywhere from entering new markets, or it can be something that actually didn't exist 5-6 years ago, being able to monetize just the customer data that you can collect on your website. And what makes it even more difficult is actually, if you look at the first 3 points, that the performance is not improving as fast as people expected. The 2 in the middle are talking about that actually there's a lot of money to be won or lost if you actually do this right. And then to make this a perfect storm, you have 61% of organizations reporting that actually their customer expectations for performance increased over the last 12 months. Going back to one of the previous slides and talking about why there are 180 vendors that actually matter and being used in parallel in many cases, is because this is a complex issue and actually it has a major impact on the business. And speaking about the impact on the business, these are some of the numbers. On average, and just to give you a little background on organizations that we surveyed, there was a good mix of large organizations and large internet properties and SMB companies that have a somewhat of the web presence. So when you average it all out, there's $72,000 that's being reported as being lost due to 1 minute of service outage. What makes it even worse is actually that if 1 minute is that costly, that 48% of these organizations are saying they're spending 60 minutes per incident troubleshooting issues. So if you do the math and actually multiply these numbers, that's a lot of money being lost just per one single incident. But one story that's actually being kind of hidden between just basic availability and this story that a lot of organizations understand. If you are generating revenue through your website and it's down, you don't know exactly what the numbers are, but it's definitely not good. One story that's actually being hidden is that if your website is actually experiencing performance problems in terms of page load times and some of the things that we talked about earlier, digital experience aspects in terms of content, in terms of integration, these issues are actually 10 times more likely to happen as compared to issues with availability. There are a lot of organizations out there that, for the most part, figure out how to keep their site up. But being able to actually have your site, web property high performing is 10 times more difficult to do, and actually these issues are 10 times more frequent. And then if you go back and do the math, obviously you're losing more money if your website is not up at all versus if it's experiencing performance problems. But due to frequency of performance problems, then actually over the course of the year, you're almost losing twice as much due to issues with performance problems versus issues with availability. And kind of how to solve that all. So we have a long list of capabilities and technology classes that are tackling this issue, and we mentioned some of them before. What we were able to do is actually look at the companies that are doing well. They're much less likely to experience issues and revenue loss that we talked about before, and see what is it that they're doing that's so different as compared to all others. And we identified top 6 areas based on just percentages and numbers that were reported. Visibility into all aspects of user experience. We talked about those 5. Uh, Speed and availability, we talked, that's been around for 10 plus years, and being able to actually use your monitoring and management tools to get into other three that are changing, API management being a very important one, is definitely making a difference. Data management and analytics, this is not necessarily specific to just digital experience delivery. We are seeing this across the board when it comes to IT performance, that there is no correlation between the amount of data that organizations are collecting and their performance improvements. This is not to say that you should not go and monitor your IT services. It's to say that actually context matters more than the amount of data that's being collected. And for the most part, especially in this market, when it comes to management aspect, that it really is becoming a game around advanced analytics and managing data that's being collected. APIs and integration, we talked about that a little bit. Obviously, there are two different aspects of that: being able to design APIs, being able to put them in place, but also being able to test and monitor them. And one area that I think is really interesting, and it was kind of lost in some of the findings that we were talking about before. Public cloud infrastructure was definitely a part of the landscape, as you saw earlier, and we're all seeing more organizations moving more services to the cloud. There are some barriers that were around for a while in some industry verticals around security, around compliance. But if you look at this research data, there are a lot of hybrid environments where some services are being hosted on-premise, some services are being hosted in the cloud. From a management perspective, the problem is a lot of organizations are using different tools to monitor these services depending on where they are. And once you try to make sense of all of that, it brings us to the second point around data management and analytics is sometimes it's not humanly possible to look at 5 or 6 different screens and actually find what the root cause of the problem is. So being able to have a single platform for monitoring cloud and on-premise infrastructure is one of the difference makers. Number 5, managing the entire stack really brings us back to the Techscape graphic that we talked about earlier. Being able to understand the service that you are delivering or experience that you're delivering to your customers from the point of understanding the code to the point to be able to be proactive and prevent performance issues, to understand what the real user experience really is. And that end-to-end visibility is, again, one of the difference makers. And one area that's really important, we talked about technology as a competitive advantage. You can have all kinds of monitoring tools in place, and you can set your own thresholds and understand where you should issue alerts and how to deal with managing your environment. If you can't look over your shoulder and see what is happening across the fence and what your competitors are doing, then you can't really create a competitive advantage by using the technology. That you, just because you are meeting the goals and SLAs that you set for yourself, doesn't mean that actually you can go and translate that into business success. So being able to understand how your performance compares to your industry, your closest competitors, and its capability is very important. And so it's one two-step process: is understanding your performance, but also understanding how it stacks up to the market as a whole. And we talked about a lot of things today, so I just want to summarize it. As Peter mentioned, we will be sending data from this presentation, but before we wrap this up, I think 6 key areas that we should probably spend a few minutes on and diving deeper into. Taking a holistic approach for digital experience delivery, it pays off. We talked about the impact if you don't do it right. There's also an impact in people that are really creating competitive advantage, as we talked about before, if they actually do it right. We also talked about digital transformation, and there are a lot of technologies that are making headlines out there when it comes to digital transformation, that they are new and innovative, that didn't exist a couple of years ago. But if you look at what digital transformation really means to people, which is customer engagement and and experience, and technology is a competitive advantage, that is one-to-one correlation with what the value proposition of digital experience delivery technologies is. The definition of user experience is changing. We talked about how it's changed over the last 7 or 8 years with new areas, but that is really not the end game. That it constantly is changing based on changes in user demographics, changes in their preferences. We talk about personalization. We talk about integration. We talk about technology aspect of actually how user experience is being created. So being able to be flexible and actually address these issues and watch the market as it changes is a really important area, as opposed to setting a strategy in place for the next 5 years that might change in 6 months. We talked about the landscape before, and obviously there's a lot of complexity there. For simplicity purposes, we broke it into 4 major categories and 17 different subcategories. One thing is important to keep in mind, and you should not be confused about, even those 17 subcategories, solutions that are profiled there are not designed equal, and very often they don't even compete against each other. Very often they are addressing problems that are very, very specific. So when evaluating different technology solutions, the best approach to take is actually do a situational analysis. At the end of the day, you're not looking for a market leader, or you're not looking for the best product in the market. You're looking for the product that's actually the best fit for you, based on your use case and based on what you're looking to address. And I thought it was important to mention. And also, one area we saw as we were doing this research is that a lot of organizations that have awareness of how important this issue is, they will go and try to put resources together in-house, take some open source tools and patch them all together and try to build their own solution. Sometimes it works, more often it doesn't. It is a very complex issue and actually ends up costing more. If they're trying to save money from investing in enterprise technologies, that at the beginning does make sense. But if you actually spend 3, 4, 5, 6 months trying to do this by yourself, and then you end up coming back to evaluating different technologies, and you make that investment at the end of the day anyway, the time that you spend in the meantime is just not worth it. And the final point that I think is really important is that in this space, when it comes to digital experience, being proactive is really something that doesn't have an alternative. That you can be alerted of the problem that you have, you can go troubleshoot, you can go fix it. Think about some of the examples that you all know very well about that happened over the last 6 months that made the headlines, way outside IT technology. When it comes to money, when it comes to security, when it comes to being able to actually manage your property, being able to understand what your bottlenecks are, addressing them ahead of time, as opposed to learning about them on the fly, there are some applications out there that are being used internally that, if they're down for an hour, 2, 3 hours, you can kind of survive. But in this space, you really can't afford that. So with that said, I will pass to Zach, and I will also be here to answer any questions that you might have towards the end of the presentation.
Great. So thanks, Boyan. Welcome to the meeting here. And so I will be taking control and kind of going over some of the points around monitoring and how to build a digital strategy for monitoring around some of the things that Boyan has talked about here. Great. So my portion of today's kind of webinar will be how has digital transformation changed what it means to monitor the end user experience. And so this is a quick introduction to us and to where we come from. I'm working here at Catchpoint. We are a digital experience intelligence platform. And so we're built to monitor and help manage from that end user perspective some of these things that Boyan has talked about, the speed, the availability, the reliability, the idea of brand protection, protecting your revenue, making sure your IT ops are performing in an excellent manner. Catchpoint is kind of built to help capture that data, analyze it, and make it actionable for you. And that's kind of what our platform is built around. And so when we actually talk about the monitoring and the management of the digital experience, we kind of go and figure out, well, what has changed and what is going to be changing when implementing these new technologies. So two things are really going to be changing, and the things you have to kind of be aware about when you are managing is going to be the idea of the end user is changing, and how you develop your site, how you develop your app, any underlying architecture, any underlying third parties being used. That can be changing as well, and we'll be continuously evolving. So how are we going to build a monitoring strategy to actually impact that and kind of reflect that as well? And so when we talk about the changing end user, we're actually talking about actual visitors and actual people that are working, interacting with your application. So these end users are going to be dispersed across different geographies, different areas around the globe, be accessing via different devices, different networks. And as Boyan was mentioning, they're not only going to be outside on the public internet, they actually are going to be inside your firewall, whether they're accessing internal applications, internal portals, but also when they are accessing these applications and websites, they have that kind of rich omnichannel experience. So whichever way they're actually going to interact with your website or with your application actually matters. And all that kind of builds that brand, builds your presence, and will kind of all conform to the idea that user expectations are going to rise. So all these different things, different ways people can interact with your site, you're going to build out these expectations, and they're only going to get higher and higher from that actual end user. And so we actually talked about the differences in site and app architecture and how it's going to evolve. You know, technology like transitioning to the cloud, the idea of containers, microservices, adoptions, and kind of scaling up these large technology deployments. Not only if you're doing it in-house, but also perhaps you may be relying on third parties and third-party technology. And also the fact that many other technologies are going to come in and make it very complex, very perhaps difficult to manage at first sight. All these things are changing, and the way you're developing is changing. So the risk in actually increasing of poor performance is actually rising as well. So it's really key to make sure that you know that things are changing both in the end user and the way that things are being developed in the space. And that does have a risk of actually impacting end user experience overall. And so this kind of all wraps around the idea that complexity as a whole can be a killer to the actual digital end user experience. So customers' expectations are growing. You need to grow your business to meet those expectations. Then you may actually increase the IT complexity. So it's kind of that cycle of you need to actually always be ahead of it and be more proactive to actually address any issues. So when we talk about IT complexity, it's things like databases, browsers, code, latency, CDNs, third parties, all the things that make your actual website or application work, but not necessarily the end user actually sees that there are actually different parties involved. So from a management standpoint, understand that complexity is key, and all the end user needs to see is that they are having a positive experience, they are engaged with the platform as well. And so the first objective when you actually kind of go into monitoring from that whole digital management point of view is to understand your users. And so what we mean by understanding the users is actually capturing real user measurements from them, also known as a realm platform. And so when we talk about this kind of point of view, it's, okay, let's sample and let's actually capture some passively acting data as people actually interact with their applications and websites. Understand what are their top pages, what top portions of the application they're visiting, where are they coming from, are they coming over on certain devices, certain browsers, and now make sure that when you actually are capturing real user measurement, that you're actually capturing metrics that are meaningful and have a lot of value to your organization. So one performance metric may be great for one type of service, but for another type of service, it may be completely different. You can think of things like above the fold time, speed index type measurements, where it could be relevant to, say, time to first byte or other measurements for another platform. And so having those key optimal performance metrics from the actual end user, the real user measurement, is very powerful. And then also being able to correlate that to a more business and engagement side to say this is where your conversions are being impacted, this is where you're losing page views, you're losing, facing increasing number of bounces on your site, for example. So having that real user perspective to kind of guide you is very key because it is that true digital experience of the site. And so next, I'm going to go ahead and actually talk about how to protect your end users. So kind of real user and RUM, it's all about understanding your end users and seeing how they actually naturally experiencing it. The idea of protecting it is, okay, let's be proactive and try to focus our monitoring with data that we can trust and that we know is actionable, and actually go ahead and protect that end user experience. So this is with the idea of synthetic, both on the public space and the on-premise space as well, so both internal and external, as well as network monitoring and alerting come into play. So when you think about synthetic, you have to make sure that you're expanding where you're going to be monitoring from. So if you're seeing users come from emerging markets like China, portions of Africa, Europe, North America, South America, make sure you're monitoring in those key areas and you're having a proactive data source captured from those areas. Make sure you're also monitoring the type of data that's going to be serving those devices that people are coming on. Are these just websites? Are they mobile optimized websites? Are they APIs that are feeding data to a application or a mobile phone, for example? So make sure you're monitoring the type of data on those different types of devices and different types of platforms. But also make sure you're doing it over the type of networks people are visioning from. So performance data on a backbone network is much different than, say, on a wireless or last mile network. So making sure you have insight onto that kind of proactive view from across those different networks. And as a whole, traditionally monitoring has been around the simple endpoints, making sure you also do it around user paths and transactions that are dynamic enough to address and correlate to the actual ways people are interacting with your site. And all of this kind of applies both on the public and on-premise space. So making sure that you do have points of view internally and externally across all those different applications and sites you may be trying to monitor. And then, so when you know what's actually going on from the real user data, you have that sample, you can actually expand what your critical alerting thresholds are in a kind of more proactive manner. So if you know that key point where people start to drop off, or you know that key point where they aren't engaged as much, making sure that your synthetic or your proactive monitoring is actually addressing that, is actually those kind of critical thresholds are what you're using your alerts for. So this whole different idea of real user and synthetic is trying to be marry them together to get that kind of true representation of that end user experience, and in both a understanding reactive manner as well as a proactive kind of synthetic manner as well. So another monitoring objective besides protecting your end users, understanding them, is actually making sure that you're monitoring the technologies from their perspective as well that are giving them that experience. So think of your CDN providers, your DNS providers, your API providers, for example, any sort of digital content that's being provided on the site. So you can actually use monitoring from that end user perspective to make sure that these providers, these technology are actually performing well. So the whole kind of management of the digital experience. So when we talk about digital experience, synthetic, things like being able to separate and understand dependencies in your tech stack, being able to separate first and third-party content on your sites and applications, so anything coming from, say, ad providers, analytics, CDN, DNS providers, but also having a key way to separate that data from that true end-user performance, and being able to set alerts off of each one as well. So like the idea of having host-by-host level captured on your site, or perhaps grouping things together in what's called like a zone, for example, and having that true performance dependency mapped out. And then using this data from the actual end user to say, technology provider, you perhaps may have broken an SLA agreement of type of service you're going to provide, so making sure that you do have those true SLAs enforced and you're capturing data in a reliable perspective that both parties can agree on as well. And so, as we kind of mentioned before, third parties can be like CDN, DNS, but they can also be APIs. So you can have like third-party APIs, you have different data coming from different sources, even internal APIs. different APIs in your backend that maybe provide different data. For example, if you're using a more microservices type infrastructure. So having an insight into those key services separate from that kind of full end user would actually make it much more actionable. So making sure you're monitoring service uptime, downtime, response times of those individual APIs, then triggering alerts when any of those individual APIs generate errors. Kind of think of that Orbit use case that Boyan mentioned, where the page is loading fine, but if you had independent monitors on those APIs you're referencing, you can know if actual content is not being pulled into the platform, for example. This provides a bit more granularity, a bit more flexibility, and even doing this in a more transactional manner as well, where you may call an OAuth, for example, be an authenticated user, actually trying to simulate the actual API calls your application or website is making. And it kind of happens both on your testing environments, kind of production environments, and all around it's going to be built around monitoring SLAs of any data being provided by these APIs as well. Great. And so a fourth objective, not only are you going to be evaluating and kind of monitoring those technology and technology providers, you actually use it to evaluate and select the optimal one that's going to fit you and give you the proper ROI for you. So think, again, evaluating and selecting optimal CDNs, DNS, cloud, marketing technologies, for example. So synthetically, it's a great way to actually compare from a clean lab environment, performance of one provider against the other. Think of a general topic of request overrides. So if you want to evaluate a DNS provider, well, let's override our DNS in the synthetic tool, have that flexibility to allow that. Or perhaps if you're evaluating CDN provider, let's direct our traffic native through the tool itself to a certain CDN versus another. So having that ability to do that and have the tool, to quickly on the fly give you those side-by-side comparisons without having to go through large hoops to actually set it up is very key. But also making sure, again, that it's testing geographically so that performance or the improvement that the technology is supposed to provide is being carried across all the areas that your end users are visiting from. Same thing with network types and things of that as well. But also having the powerful analytics behind that data capture to go ahead and say, we're providing this data and we're actually comparing apples to apples in terms of data granularity, in terms of type of data. And we actually don't rely just on averages. Kind of that saying is meaning to say that things can be hidden in certain things of the chart. So if you do modal analysis, you need to go ahead and analyze just the 95th percentile, and making sure you have access to all that raw data for analyzing and comparing one vendor to another, or one technology provider to another as well. So you can provide that optimal one that is going to meet you and your business's use case. Great. So in summary, when we talk about monitoring from the digital end user experience, it is all about having that data available from that real user perspective, having that focus your synthetic and proactive monitoring, and then having that be that full end user management portion. So you know that you're understanding how your users are visiting your site, you know their factors, and you know what key things can impact their experience if you are monitoring your vendors properly and your technology providers properly. And having those alerts that can be actionable and bubble up into things like dashboards, feed into other data sources through APIs. So having all those things being proactive and understanding is going to be very key overall. And so that's kind of a quick overview of monitoring strategies from a kind of digital experience platform. I'm actually going to pass it over to Elon. He's going to talk about some of the more things around containers and microservices as well.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us today. So I'm Elon with Datadog, as was mentioned, and we'll chat a little bit today about containers and dynamic infrastructure and how they tend to impact how we monitor. Before we get into that, I wanted to offer just a quick overview of who Datadog is and what we do. We're a SaaS-based infrastructure and application monitoring platform. We have an open source agent that runs on your hosts and collects time series data from your infrastructure components and tracing data from your applications using our new APM offering. We're collecting about 1 trillion data points per day from across the world, so that's just to give you a sense of our scale. And we use that data to give you some intelligent, actionable alerting, insightful dashboards from all those metrics that you submit to us to try to address some of the some of the items that Zach talked about around offering you some deep analytics around and machine learning around those metrics that you're gathering, just so you can make the right decisions. So what do we mean by monitoring your applications and infrastructure? Well, as you can see here, we're talking about all different parts of your stack. Boyan mentioned some of the challenges with different teams using different tooling to monitor different components of your infrastructure, and some of the disconnect that can appear there. Zach talked a little bit about the need to share consistent metrics around your team and make sure that your teams and your organization are speaking the same language, and that's where we like to come in and try to help solve that problem. We'll help you monitor everything from your underlying infrastructure with cloud providers like Amazon or Google or Azure, or even in your own private data centers, all the way up the stack, to things like databases like Postgres or Cassandra or Redis, or your individual applications using our APM offering, and even other monitoring tools. So we'll integrate with Catchpoint, for example, to help you bring that synthetic and RUM data into Datadog, so you can get a sense of how some of your infrastructure or application changes might be impacting end user performance. Really, we think that all of this monitoring data is significantly more useful when it's brought together and you're able to look at it in a single platform rather than bouncing around between different point solutions. In general, you should think about monitoring without metrics, similar to driving your car down the highway with the headlights off in a rainstorm. You're just not going to have the visibility that you need in order to know whether or not you're performing well and meeting your customers' demands as you make these as you move into the digital world, or worse yet, when you have a crash and all of our code is fallible at some point or another. You are going to have an issue. When you have that issue, you're either not going to be able to detect it before it impacts your customers, or resolve it quickly once the issue is identified. The worst situation to be in is to not have those key metrics to know why an issue occurred. We all run postmortems within our organizations, or at least we should. And you never want to be in a situation where the primary action item in your postmortem is add more monitoring so we know what happens next time, why it happened, or what happened the next time we experience an issue or an outage. If you're not familiar with Honest Update, he offers a little bit of levity and comedy to our IT and DevOps lives. Check him out on Twitter. But this sort of goes to illustrate the point that if we don't have if we don't have metrics and monitoring in place, we really aren't going to know why those issues occurred, and our customers are not going to be satisfied with our explanations as to how we're going to avoid those outages in the future. So how does this relate to containers and dynamic infrastructure? Well, as we're as the main reason a lot of us are moving to the cloud and to dynamic infrastructure and more recently to containers is we want to be a little bit more efficient with how we do our application and our application deployment, how we ship those bits around. Much like how containers revolutionized the shipping industry and allowed us to move physical objects around the world, for our shipments much more quickly and in a standardized fashion. Containers and the cloud are offering us a similar set of tooling around moving our applications and our binaries around. That being said, while it offers a great deal of standardization and simplification around how we deploy our applications, it's important to know that there's probably some operational complexity in there as well that we have to keep in mind. It's also important to keep in mind that a lot of these technologies, that despite the fact that they've become sort of common to our conversations and to our technical designs and to our discussions within the tech industry, this is all still relatively new. If we take a look at the timeline real quick, you kind of get a sense. I mean, the cloud is, at least in the way we know it today, is only about a decade old. EC2 went GA there about 10 years ago. More recently than that, we're looking at things like our monitoring tooling for our modern tooling for managing infrastructures. As we look at Docker and containers being about 3 to 4 years old. More recently than that, Kubernetes and Mesos and all of these other pieces are just in the last year or two starting to hit 1.0. So despite the fact that we're all excited about them and they're definitely getting adopted quite quickly. A lot of the best practices and learnings around how to take advantage of these are still being formed, and these technologies are still pretty young. So it's important to keep that in mind as we're diving in with both feet into these waters. So with that in mind, Datadog started to run, data is in our name, and so data is quite important to us. So about a year and a half ago, we started running studies about adoption of Docker and containers and our orchestration among our customers. And so the rest of the slides here are informed by, by the metrics that we gathered from that study. So I mentioned the phrase operational complexity earlier, and it's important to define define complexity as we're talking about it. We define it as the number of things that you're measuring, and then the velocity at which those things or those resources are changing. So looking at the looking at the cloud world, we'll note that most cloud providers are offering about 10 metrics. Your operating systems, Datadog notes customers are collecting about 100 metrics from there, and maybe 50 metrics per application. As we extrapolate that for containers, you can kind of see we go from about 160 metrics per host to about 150 times the number of containers that you may be running. If you have a fairly small environment, about 100 nodes, we'll kind of work on the math from there. So in our study, we noted that most folks are running about 5 containers at a time on their hosts. Some are more, some are less, depends on your workload, but the average was about 5. And so we'll use that number through the rest of this presentation. So again, assuming you have that 100 instances in a relatively small Amazon environment, that's bringing you to about 500 containers. From there, you quickly, as you do the math, you realize that you're looking at about 80,000. You're going from about from a small number of metrics to about 80,000 metrics, and ideally you're collecting them at a fairly high granularity, as Zach mentioned earlier, and not keeping them as averages. That's a lot to look at and a lot to keep track of. So you might find yourself with a little bit of metrics overload. It's important to find yourself some tooling that will help you make sense of that and keep track of that as your infrastructure shifts underneath you. So clearly we have the number of things to measure, and containers and microservices have added some complexity there. What about velocity of change? So one thing that we noted is that VMs these days are living about 15 days, and that number is ever decreasing. So by VMs we mean those are individual hosts in your cloud providers. Containers, on the other hand, are lasting about 2.5 days, and again that number is also ever decreasing with schedulers and orchestrators. So with containers living about 1/6 the lifetime of VMs, the velocity of change there is obviously let us check off that second box for operational complexity. We're no longer able to name our hosts after the planets or our favorite pets or some other funny naming scheme. We really have to get away from managing resources in that way. Similarly, our deployments and our provisioning have gone from hours to minutes or months to days. Everything that we're doing has just been sped up that much more as we add as we use containers and dynamic infrastructure as the grease for our organization's wheels as we try to improve our velocity. So clearly we've checked off both boxes, and we have all of the components needed to have a little bit of complexity here. So even though those containers are helping us standardize our deployments, there's a bit of challenges there. That being said, let's look at this. I mean, we talked about this all being fairly recently adopted, just in the last couple of years here. So in that same study, one of the things that we looked at is how is the adoption cycle of containers within our customer base. And we noted that in 1 year we had about 5x increase from 2014 to 2015. Since then, through May 2016, we saw an additional 30% increase here. With that in mind, it's also important to note that the folks that are adopting Docker tend to stick with it. You'll notice that this abandoned line here is quite low on the slide. To give you a sense of that, earlier we talked about how Datadog is collecting about a trillion metrics a day. In terms of the technologies that we're monitoring, we noticed that about in the 18 months of this study, we also saw Docker reporting go up to 10% of the hosts that we're monitoring. So as you can see, the adoption is quite high, especially in the organizations that we work with. And then, in terms of adoption, this isn't just a thing that organizations are picking up once and using as is. They're really continuing to run with it. Over 9 months, we see the average organization 5x the amount of Docker, the 5x the amount of Docker that they're reporting into Datadog and in their organization. So, to bring back our good friend Honest Update, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of this data came from organizations that were primarily working with Docker on its own. As we add containers, cluster managers, and orchestrators, these numbers will continue to change, and it's going to be even more complex to track where our applications are running, what their health is, and really having the right tooling to do that is key. So keep that in mind as you're collecting and generating those metrics. So in quick summary, some of the lessons are make sure that you have well-defined metrics. Those are key to having visibility into the success or failure of your digital transformation. Containers and dynamic infrastructure are really going to change the way we're monitoring. Just the frequency of change and the volume of data that we'll be looking at really requires some strong tooling that's able to do so. And then finally, try to take a monitoring-driven development practice. For many years, we've been talking about test-driven development. Monitoring-driven development is just an extension of that. It's going to help you ensure that you have the visibility you need from the start, that you're monitoring your infrastructure and your applications from development through production, so that you know what normal is long before your first user ever hits the site. So use that approach to help sort of keep your bearings in these dynamic environments as you're moving to the cloud and containers. And with that, thank you very much. Looking forward to chatting with you all more during our Q&A section.
Great, thank you so much, Elon. So I'm just going to unmute the rest of the presenters, and I apologize. We're up against 1:58 right now. I think we have a little bit extra time to field some questions. So if anybody has any last-minute questions, we already have a few in. Please feel free to type those questions in now. This is your time with the three technology experts that we've brought for you guys today. So everybody should be unmuted, and we do have a couple questions. So I'll just quickly tackle them right now. So one question came in: what are some of the key trends in DEJ's research around monitoring performance of microservices? And obviously, I'll kick this one off to Boyan because it was directed at you.
There are a couple of things. It's interesting because next major publishing initiative we will have after this will be around microservices, and there's a reason for that. It goes to a couple of areas, and Elon talked about them earlier, anywhere from adoption. So in our research, we saw 61% of organizations reported participated in our research that actually they are planning to look into benefits of deploying container-based architectures in the next 12 months. Obviously, some of them will, some of them we'll see if it's the best fit for them, but there's a pretty high number in terms of technology that's fairly new in the enterprise. And going back to some of the management challenges that Elon talked about earlier, folks that actually already deployed microservices, 46% of them are saying that actually the management tools they already had in place once they made that move and started building their applications based on using container-based architectures, 46% of them said that monitoring tools that they have in place were not effective. And Elon talked about it a little bit before, that it is a completely different game, that the way that container-based architectures are being designed are very difficult to manage with tools that were built 15, 20 years ago. And one area that's also important to keep in mind, if you are looking to monitor performance, there is a major difference between production and pre-production. That in our research, we asked about the availability of microservices when tested in pre-production and availability of microservices in production. There is 96% availability in production. People, for the most part, figure it out. That number drops to 74% when actually they go to production and they lose visibility because of all technology aspects of how dynamic this architecture is. And we also talked about the importance of analytics. There are a lot of organizations out there that are using individual tools for monitoring, not just one microservice, for monitoring one container within a microservice. If you try to correlate the data, uh, it becomes very difficult. And when we talked about analytics and data management before, so it's a very complex issue, and it's actually causing a lot of power shift in the market from a technology perspective.
Great. And actually, there was a follow-up question to that I'll direct, I think, to Elon. One attendee asked, what are key traits organizations are looking for effective container monitoring?
So I would say it's the number one thing is having a monitoring system that is built for dynamic infrastructure and for changes in your environment. Even if you're using something like configuration management to manage your static configurations of a monitoring system. I mean, your chef and even the most aggressive organizations are probably running like having their chef runs converge on maybe 4 or 5 minutes. You can imagine as you tie that into containers, which are moving around on the order of an order of minutes at times on the shorter scale, or with VMs that are in auto scaling groups, your config management runs are not going to be nearly as tight as your VMs or your VMs or containers or other resources are coming and going. So you really want to look for tools that let you ask more dynamic questions of your system. So, for example, show me the response times across all of my applications or across all of my pods or across all of my containers, rather than saying, show me how this individual host is performing. Really getting away from that static configuration to asking dynamic questions that apply to your business regardless of the scale of that day. And then, the other thing I'd say is looking for something that lets you leverage all the tags and metadata that exist in your underlying infrastructure, whether you're using a cloud provider like Amazon or Google or Azure or OpenStack, or the containers above it, or orchestrators like Kubernetes or Mesos. They all offer some amount of metadata that you can use as tags or labels to form those questions and queries within your monitoring tools. And so that level of dynamicism is key to being successful, I would say.
Excellent. I think this could be tackled by all, but the question came in. I'm going to direct this at Zach. Have monitoring tools kept up with advancements in mobile applications used by enterprise businesses? Is there anything that you've seen, Zach?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the answer would be yes. So when we talk about monitoring like mobile applications used by enterprise businesses, there are going to be an underlying set of APIs that can be, from an end user perspective, be monitored. Kind of having those SLAs around those experiences, having the insight both from an on-premise, both an external point of view, from an end user experience that has been keeping up. And I'm pretty certain it has been keeping up on more application, more infrastructure level side as well.
Excellent. I think we have time for one final question before we head out. And I'll kick this off to Boyan because it seems to be directed at some of the research that he's done. What are some of the biggest changes in the technology ecosystems that you've seen over the past few years?
That's a great question. I mean, we have 17 subcategories that I mentioned before. I think we spent a bulk of time today focusing on the management section. We also talked about development. I think development is definitely something that emerged quite a bit. And Elon talked about Docker and all the chefs of the world and new technologies that are entering the enterprise and becoming a mainstream. And also from a performance testing perspective, there's a lot of information needs to be processed. And I mean, one thing we're seeing on the performance testing side is that we talked about the revenue loss and kind of why it matters, and we talked about some of the numbers, but those numbers are in dollars and cents. One thing that we are seeing in the market is the whole notion around IoT that it's entering the enterprise, entering the mainstream much faster than I think anybody anticipated. And the value proposition was clear, but there are a lot of folks out there talking about the technology is not ready for a prime time, and there are no management platforms. But also at the same time, if you think how fast it actually is entering the enterprise, if you look at the companies like major car manufacturers, Toyotas and Hondas of the world, that are marketing themselves now as a software companies. So performance testing piece is no longer just about dollars and cents. It can be lost. It's importance is actually increasing because, as opposed to losing hundreds of millions of dollars, we can be looking at lives being lost, and we're definitely seeing more innovation in that. And I think two areas in the management section that I think are important to keep an eye on. One is the whole notion of analytics, and I'll kind of lump it together with the notification and alerting because there is some overlap there and some underlying technologies that are somewhat similar. We talked about the metrics overload earlier, and what is really making a difference. There's 41% of organizations that were in our research that are saying they're using 10 or more IT monitoring tools, and they're experiencing major issues. There's 89% of organizations in our research that said that the amount of data that they collected over the last 12 months increased as compared to the year before, and only 38% of them said their performance improved. So being able to process this information, put it in the right context, I think cuts across a lot of management sections. And also at the same time, one thing that's important to, we talked about application performance in general a couple of times today. And if you look at the evolution of that market, that you had, say back in 2010, 2011, you probably had 50 or 60 vendors that wanted to be associated with a term application performance monitoring because it was emerging and it was a hot topic, and it was there were people on the end user side who were willing to invest in that. And if you look at over the last 5 years how market dynamics in that environment changed, that actually folks that are somewhat of the market leaders now didn't even exist in that time. And then Lon talked about microservices and containers, and that's causing another shift that even those market leaders from 2 years ago can't catch up with that. So one general area that we're seeing across the landscape is actually the speed of innovation, speed of changes is definitely picking up over the last couple of years. We had a podcast, it was 4 or 5 years back, and that was talking about how cloud is entering the enterprise kind of the same way that personal computers and smartphones were, which is they were coming from a consumer side. There was somebody who brought their PC to work and tried to make it work. Somebody who brought their BlackBerry in that time and trying to hook up their email. And there was somebody who brought cloud in the enterprise to use either Gmail or some Google apps or something like Dropbox. But if you look at these other, and all of a sudden, from 1 or 2 people using this, you have a whole IT department trying to manage smartphones as a corporate initiative. You have CIO looking at the cloud as something that can be a source of competitive advantage. So this is a kind of long-winded answer, but I think that the bottom line is the speed of innovation is causing the power shift across each of those 17 areas. And that's being driven by technologies that are coming to the enterprise, and IoT is a good example. They are coming much, much faster than we were seeing 5, 6, 10 years ago.
Excellent. Great. I think we've pushed the limit on the extra time here, so I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you all for attending. There's some fantastic questions. We didn't get to all of them actually, so we'll be following up individually with the folks who had their questions left unanswered, unfortunately. But a big thank you to Zach, to Boyan, to Elon, for a fantastic presentation. And again, just to repeat, we have recorded the webinar and we'll be sending it out tomorrow morning. That's obviously barring any kind of software, letdowns, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. But if you have any additional questions for the speakers, we'll have representatives reach out over the next few days, and you can go to any of the links on the screen that we're showing there to learn more about the sponsors of the webinar, DEJ, Catchpoint, and Datadog. Thank you again to all the speakers and all the attendees, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.